Hey guys, welcome to Digit.in, and today we're going to be reviewing Narzo's first smartphone to launch in 2021, the Narzo 30A. Now, this phone is a very interesting device because it takes a lot of inspiration from something that's already come before it, and if far too much in fact, and at the same time it does try to differentiate itself from what's already available in the market. So for all of the details, make sure to keep watching this video. But before you do, make sure to hit the subscribe button on our channel and of course hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any future updates from us. Now with that out of the way, let's get right into the specs. The Narzo 30A is powered by the MediaTek Helio G85 processor, which is an octa-core chip with 6 Cortex A55 cores and 2 Cortex A75 cores. The review unit that we're testing has 4 GB of RAM and 64 GB of storage, and of course also comes with a dedicated micro SD card slot. You've got a 6.55-inch IPS LCD panel with a 720p resolution, and on the back you have a 13 megapixel dual camera setup, whereas on the front you get an 8 megapixel selfie camera. The battery in here measures 6000 mAh and charges over USB-C, and for those of you interested, there is also a headphone jack incorporated into the smartphone. Now let's actually see how all of this on paper spec translates to real world performance. Now when it comes to real world performance of the smartphone, we're actually quite surprised by how well the G85 still holds up despite being a slightly older chipset. First, let's go over the synthetic benchmarks. Antutu score of 201,000 is still impressive by every metric, and there's of course also the Geekbench 5 scores, which is 350 for single core and 1283 for multi-core. If these scores don't sound familiar to you or ring a bell, well, they do for us. Interestingly, these are also the scores from last year's Narzo 20. Narzo 20 actually gets a score of 202,909 for Antutu, and on Geekbench 5 scores 349 for single core and 1286 for multi-core. The difference in these two scores are well within the margin of error that you would get if you was to run the same benchmark on the same device over and over again, which actually led us down a very interesting path of discovery. The Narzo 30A and the Narzo 20 are practically the same device. We'll talk about that in a little more detail towards the end of this review. But for now, let's just cover performance. While the CPU performance is admirable for this price point, in terms of the GPU benchmarks, we see some pretty decent numbers as well. However, while the 3D Mark Wildlife and GFX bench numbers remain pretty much the same between the Narzo 30A and the Narzo 20, where the newer phone takes an advantage is in actual real-life gaming. When we fired up Call of Duty Mobile, we got a median frame rate of 58 FPS. Now the Narzo 20 also had the same median FPS, but the stability of the frame rates on the 30A is far higher at 39%, whereas the Narzo 20 in our testing had a stability of just 46%. Abysmal. Now when we look at Asphalt 9 as well, we see a very similar behavior. On the Narzo 30A, we hit the target 30 FPS that the game runs at, which is the same on the Narzo 20 from last year, but the stability on the 30A was 99%, whereas for Narzo 20, the stability clocked out at 72% max. So overall, we see that in terms of real world usage, the Narzo 30A does perform slightly better. This is evidenced by the fact that the software has been optimized over the year, and this hardware has basically been working much better with the software on board to deliver better results. We see a similar behavior even when it comes to battery life. The two phones have the same 6000 mAh battery, but we're getting about a day and a half of use from the Narzo 30A easy, whereas with the Narzo 20, the battery life topped out at about a full days of heavy use max, maybe going into the next morning at best. So overall, the Narzo 30A does feel like a rebadge of the Narzo 20. The hardware is the same. In fact, even the software to a great extent is very similar, but there are certain benefits that we're getting from this phone in terms of performance. However, let's talk cameras. Now, where the real differentiator between the Narzo 30A and the Narzo 20 lies is with respect to its camera. The Narzo 30A comes with a dual camera setup even though the module at the back makes you sort of kind of think that it's a triple or a quad camera setup, not the case. It's essentially two cameras working as one, delivering you the 13 megapixel output. The aperture on both of these lenses is f2.2, another downgrade when you consider what the Narzo 20 had to offer. On the Narzo 20, on the other hand, you had a 48 megapixel camera with an aperture of f1.8. You had an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera and also a macro lens. Far more versatile setup there if you consider it, but the fact that you no longer have an ultra wide lens either is definitely going to hurt. Now, when you actually do look at the photos though, we see some very interesting things. The daylight performance of the Narzo 30A's camera is pretty much what you would expect from a smartphone that costs less than 10K. That means you get really nice saturated colors, you get decent dynamic range with some clipping in the highlights every now and then, but what you don't expect is sharp critical details. So when you zoom into the images, you will see some level of smudging, and that's just because of the JPEG compression. Move over into low light situations and you have the option of using the nightscape mode, which surprisingly performs well. The final image, when you look at it on your phone, appears to be well saturated, is decently lit, but once again, when you zoom in, you find that the details are missing. This is a fair enough trade-off, especially in a smartphone of this price point, to get a usable image that you can not only just post to social media, but also keep in your phone to refer back as a memory sake. So overall, that's pretty impressive. You also have an 8 megapixel selfie camera in the front, and one thing that's common between the two cameras is the portrait mode. Now the portrait mode does deliver decent results from both the front and the back cameras, with the only caveat being that the edge detection is not the best, and frankly that's fine because that's a common problem across every smartphone irrespective of how much money you spend on it today. So overall, the Narzo 38 does perform decently well when it comes to the camera stack, with one critical drawback, and that drawback is the time between shots. While the shutter lag is not really noticeable, what you will notice is that there is a significant amount of time that the camera takes to go from one shot to the next. For example, when you press the shutter button, you can keep tapping on it rapidly, but it will not take a shot at least for the next 3 seconds. That's a significant amount of gap for the SoC to process the raw data from the sensor and convert to JPEG, essentially that whole writing process, and honestly it's not one that we are happy with. It is understandable that this is a fairly low price point, but at the same time, low price point should not justify poor user experience, because a delay between shots could definitely result in missing the decisive moment when you're trying to capture one. Now the display on the Narzo 30A is an IPS LCD panel with a 60Hz refresh rate, which is pretty standard for this price point, and of course it's a 720p panel, so that's HD plus and not full HD. On the other hand, you also don't get any kind of HDR certification, so you're just limited to watching regular SDR content. Now, typically, we would say that's a problem, but at this price point, the display does perform admirably well. It's pretty decent to use outdoors, does not have a lot of reflection problems, and if you did feel that there were issues with readability outdoors or in bright light, you could simply just remove the screen guard that's been applied for improved visibility. In fact, we've come to notice that over the last 6 months, screen guards tend to lower the readability of the panel in bright light, and removing them does tend to help. Other than that, frankly, this display is very functional. It's decently color accurate. It does not have the oversaturation characteristics that an AMOLED panel would have. So if you don't appreciate oversaturated panels, you're going to like this one. But if you do want that really poppy and really vibrant feel to your images, this may not be the panel for you, because this is more prioritizing color accuracy and real world color representation rather than oversaturation. Frankly, there is not much to talk about the display here. Just small point of detail, there's no in-display fingerprint sensor because there's one at the back for anybody who cares, and the selfie camera is actually embedded right in the top center instead of being in a corner. So that's the display part, and moving on from that, let's talk about the build and design, because that's another thing that will set this phone apart from its previous predecessor. The design of this phone is very interesting because it takes a very pixel-like approach to it. It's got this dual texture. It's not dual tone, but dual texture type finish. Frankly, it's quite nice to hold. It's grippy, and that's one of the best things about it. It is fully polycarbonate, that has to be clarified, and honestly, it doesn't feel like a cheap piece of plastic to begin with. The power button's on the right, as is the volume rocker, and they're both easy to reach with just a single thumb because the spacing between them is adequate enough. The SIM tray offers two SIM card slots because it's a dual SIM smartphone, and there is also a dedicated micro SD card slot for anybody who really cares about that thing. What's really interesting is that manufacturers still offer these dedicated slots on low-end phones, but the more money you spend on your smartphone, the lesser of them you get because hybrid SIM, and now with many flagships ditching the SD card slot altogether. Anyway, coming back to the topic at hand. The fingerprint sensor is, in my opinion, placed a little on the higher side, but I do have slightly smaller hands. If you had bigger hands, you'd be able to reach it more easily. But what is interesting is that the placement of this, while okay, the fingerprint sensor is a little hard to find because there is no ring around it, and it's a fairly seamless piece of plastic at the back. Last but not the least, the camera module thankfully does not jut out of the body too much, and if you put the phone down on a table, it's not going to wobble or fall off due to vibrations. So overall, that's a pretty good thing. But there is still the question of should you buy the Narzo 30A? And that's a very tricky question to answer because this phone is in all essence a rebranded Narzo 20. The camera modules have been completely changed out for sure, and the price point has been lowered because Narzo 20 sold for about a little over 12,000 rupees. This is going to be under 10k. Performance wise, it's identical to the Narzo 20. The display is identical to the Narzo 20. The on paper battery spec is identical to the Narzo 20. What's changed is slightly on the design side. The battery life is slightly better, but where you really differentiate it is the camera module. Now you could say that I'm happy having one camera that performs well versus having three cameras that are barely about average. That is a choice you guys get to make. But there is also in Narzo's own lineup, there's a whole bunch of other devices that you can look at, and there's of course the competition in the form of, let's say, the Redmi 9 Power, or in fact even the Poco M3. That's right. So there are a lot of options out there in the market right now for you to consider. But if you are a fan of Realme's devices, the Narzo 38 does make a good case for itself because it brings a tier that was over 10k into the sub 10k range. So you do have, there is a notable fact there. But overall, decent device by itself, but when you put it in the context of everything else out there, it sort of does seem to get lost. But over a period of time, we shall see how this device holds up in our long-term usage, and we will of course update you on that as well. Thank you guys for watching this video. Before you leave, make sure to hit the subscribe button on our channel, and of course also hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any future updates from us. As for me, you're going to see me in the next one.